Glenn, tell me something about when you were in Italy, when you first arrived in Italy and you were assigned to your base in, I believe it was in Foggia, and something about your day. Uh, how actually did the day go down when you were there?
Uh, well, to begin with, I had a twin brother, Hugh Dow, who went in very early into the war. We were both fascinated by flying, and he voluntarily left Texas, went to Canada, went through the Royal Canadian Air Force, went to England, flew Hurricanes in the RAF. But then America became involved in the war, and he was promptly transferred on September 29, 1942, to North Africa because Eisenhower was getting ready to invade North Africa to do battle against Rommel, the Africa Corps, the German Army Africa Corps. In any event, him having been in the fighter squadrons, I always wanted to join him and had a great interest in becoming a fighter pilot like my twin brother. And I kept asking for fighter training as I went through the 3 stages of training. You have primary, basic, and finally advanced. And I kept being sent toward bombers. And I said, how come you don't ever approve my going into single engine fighters? And they said, well, a fighter plane is a defensive weapon and we're now on offense, and what we need are bombers and lots of bomber pilots. So that's what you're going to become. Mm-hmm. We have all the fighter pilots we need, but we are rolling out new bombers, both B-17s and B-24s, at 1 or 2 a day, and we've got to have more bomber pilots. So I was transferred into bomber training, and my crew was made up in Tonopah, Nevada. Boy, you talk about out in the boondocks. And anyway, I got, of course, acquainted with this crew of 10 men on a B-24 Liberator, and there were 10 men on a B-17 Flying Fortress, they called it. And we finished our training in about 2 months at Tonopah, Nevada, and we were sent to the West Coast in San Francisco. And I felt sure I was heading to the war out in the Pacific, but that was wrong. I was at Hamilton Air Force Field, which was in Marin County, California, north of San Francisco. One day they marched us down to the railroad station. We climbed on this train, and 6.5 or 7 days later we pull into Newport News, Virginia, and we climb on board this troop ship, and then it took about 7 or 8 days to sail over to Italy. And I joined a bomber group located down near Foggia, Italy. And we actually docked at Naples, got off that boat. They put us on a British ship that sailed down the west coast of Italy, down or around the boot of Italy and back up the east side, until we got to about Bari, and that's where we are Toronto, or Bari, and that's where we were disembarked and taken by trucks, what we call 6x6 Army trucks, up to Foggia, to this bombing field, bomber airport. And I was in the 776th Squadron of the 464th Bomb Group. And there was a number of these giant bombing airports in that area. And I can remember being on raids where there would be 1,000 American or Allied bombers. The Americans were mostly on the west half of Italy, and the British were over on the eastern half of Italy. And we would have to, when it was time to go on a mission to drop bombs on Germany or Austria, we had to get up about 4 a.m. in the morning. We slept in a tent, and you had a cot, a canvas cot with wooden legs, and it was winter time, and it was cold as could be, and we had a sleeping bag but no blankets.
Oh my goodness.
So you really never got warm at night. Then they'd get you up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and you'd go to the mess tent, it was called. That's where they served breakfast, which was simply a long wooden table, and there were no chairs. You ate your breakfast standing up. You went through the chow line, and they had this stuff that we all nicknamed it SOS, and that stood for shit on a shingle. It was a terrible tasting thing, and you maybe got a half a cup of coffee, and you got this cereal of some kind, and so you stood up and ate your breakfast off of this tin mess plate. They'd stack them one on top of another. They'd have dozens of them there, and you came through this line and you took off the top one, and each of these plates had about 3 or 4 compartments to it, and where, you know, you'd put some kind of a cereal in here, maybe a piece of toast over here, maybe a few raisins and another one. Anyway, that was a pretty abbreviated breakfast. Then we loaded up in these 6x6 trucks and went down to the flight line to prepare for the mission. Well, the crew chief, which is always a sergeant in charge of the engineering part of that airplane, to be sure that the engines were running all properly, he had to start all 4 engines, run them up to their maximum power, and be sure the magnetos were working properly, because the magnetos send that spark plug across the arc of a spark plug, and that's what ignites the gasoline. And of course the bomber had hundreds of gallons of gasoline in it. And when it was your turn, you taxied off of your revetment down this, here's the main runway over here, and you had a long taxiway down here, and you had to stay in line until you turned at the end of the taxi strip and pulled out. Just before you pulled back out onto the main runway, you put the brakes on, you shoved all 4 throttles full forward, checked the magnetos one more time, and everything looked okay. Then you went ahead and released the brakes and taxied on out into the runway, and to begin the mission, the tower shot a flare up into the sky, and that meant it was okay for the first bombers to start down the runway to climb into the air. And so you just kept this long line of bombers, one after another, pulling out. And of course, if some bomber had an engine failure on takeoff, they just shoved that airplane off to the side. They had a bulldozer there that could just, that was the end of that airplane. And they had to get it out of the way immediately, because here they had all these other dozens of airplanes in a line trying to get down here to pull onto the runway. So the timing had to be almost perfect. And after you built up enough airspeed that you could lift the bomber with all those bombs off the air, you immediately clicked the switch that caused the landing gear wheels and the landing gear to retract up into the wing of the airplane. And you climbed on out over the end of the runway, and gradually you worked your way up. We usually would start off getting up to about 15,000 feet. But by the time we would get near Innsbruck, Austria, or actually even just as we went out of the Adriatic Sea on where we had below us was northern Italy and then Austria, and you would climb up to 25,000 feet in this B-24 bomber. And as far, depending on when your takeoff time was, I can remember when we were kind of in the middle of the bombing stream, and as far as I could see forward, here were these bombers. A line that were miles long.
Wow.
Both in front of you and behind you.
Oh, my goodness.
And we threw 3-ship formation. That's the lead bomber here, and another bomber on echelon on his right wing, and another bomber in echelon on his left wing. And it took, you had 12 bombers in a squadron. So you had 4 rows of 3 bombers apiece. And we would stair step so that you a few hundred, the top bomber group would be the highest. They might be at 26,000 feet. And then each succession would be a couple of hundred feet below the one before them. So that there was, you didn't want to be directly behind and be in the prop wash of that bomber in front of you. So it just stair stepped down this long stream of bombers. The ones that are out were the furthest out in front. They were the highest. And as the bombing stream came on over, the lower the bombing stream became, because you were trying to avoid the slipstream, all the buffeting of that air that those 4 propeller blades were throwing back. And of course, when you got close to a target, let's say this is the target here. Well, you always had what was called an IP. That was the aiming point. And the navigator, let's say this, where this crosses right here, that's the aiming, that's the IP. Here's the target. And everybody is supposed to be in perfect position by the time you get to the IP, the aiming point. And then the bombardier takes over from the pilot. Bombardier's in front, and he has controls that actually, the Norden bomb sight is telling him whether to move a little to the right or a little to the left in order that these bombs will fall right on the target. So the airplane for a few moments is actually flown by the bombardier as he had these crosshairs, and he tried to keep those right on the target. And if it did, the northern bomb sight would automatically make corrections in the airplane's configuration to keep it on target. Well, of course, the Germans could see you coming. They had radar, and they knew about what altitude you were going to be at, and oftentimes they could even figure out exactly what the target was. Maybe an hour before we got there, because they could make of course we tried to divert and come in at different angles trying to throw them off. But anyway, the 88 millimeter cannon shell from a German anti-aircraft gun, the shell is about 4 inches, at least 4 inches around, and of course the projectile is probably at least that long, and it has a brass body to it which is full of dynamite, and then the actual bomb part of it is the first 1/3 of the cannon shell, and that is packed with explosives, so that whenever they shot the anti-aircraft 88 millimeter gun projectiles up into the sky where the bombers were, when they had it all calculated ahead of time where they could set the timer as to when those explosions, when that big shell was going to explode itself, and it would throw all these fragments of steel, and if your bomber happened to get a direct hit by one of those, that was goodbye. But a lot of times, all you'd get was these fragments of shrapnel that came out into or through your airplane, and we'd come back sometimes from a mission where it looked like polka dots on the side of the airplane, where these little fragments of all those anti-aircraft shells had exploded and sent all the fragments out. And I remember our bombardier on the particular bombing crew that I was on, his name was Joseph Low, L-O-W, and he was from Niles, Michigan. And Joe was strong as an ox. That's another story. But in any event, he got one of those fragments that came through, and he was awarded the Purple Heart for receiving an injury. Fortunately, it was not a fatal injury. It creased through one of his arms, and he bled, but it was not serious. They just put a tourniquet on his arm, which we had first aid kits right aboard the airplane. About every 6 feet, they snapped a little first aid kit onto the side of the bomber that you could open up, and it had sulfamilamide, which was an antibiotic at that time, a powder that you could sprinkle on an open wound. So,
what were you guys wearing?
Oh, well, we wore 100% OD, that's olive drab, wool shirt, wool pants. We had, then you had a flight suit. Once you got your wool pants and shirt on, then you had a flight suit that you could unzip the side down the front, and it had legs just like a pair of trousers, and you put your legs through the trouser part of the flight suit, and then it just came on up over you climbed into this flight suit. Both your arms, your legs, it had a zipper that went from way down below your crotch, and you zipped it all the way up to the top. And for a while, they had put into the socks. They had special socks that we were supposed to wear because the temperature would be like 52 degrees below zero in the wintertime at 26,000 feet. And there was there was no heat in that bomber. If there was, it was ineffective. So your only chance of keeping from freezing to death was to wrap yourself in all the heavy wool clothing that you could, plus zip up your flight suit to the top. And you had two sets of gloves on. One were the little silk gloves, and the other was a leather glove that had padding inside of it. So you put on the silk gloves first, then you punched your silk glove fingers into the leather glove that had this padding in it. And the reason for that was, at that altitude, it was so cold that if you just had your bare skin and reached up and wanted to turn a gauge on or anything on the instrument panel, your flesh stuck to that metal immediately. It was just like you'd been bitten by a snake. And so when you pulled your skin loose, you literally tore some of the skin off of your finger because it had frozen against that instrument knob on the panel. Maybe you were adjusting the altimeter or one of the other instruments. And so it was pretty difficult, to say the least. And you were enormously relieved once you got halfway back to Italy. We would make it a point to go down the Adriatic Sea where there was water below you instead of ground. And of course the Germans didn't have any anti-aircraft guns out there over that sea. And so we'd stay out over the Adriatic until we got back close to Naples. And then we would come back over toward the mainland of Italy, and then on south to Foggia, and get in your bombing. It was.
What was it like, Glenn, on the way up? When did you have control of where you were going, or were you just following in a convoy of?
Well, the lead bombardier.
What did that look like as you were a co-pilot? So you were looking out.
They always picked what they thought was the most accurate bombardier navigator in the squadron to be in the lead airplane. So everybody is flying off of his wing, and he has all the maps, all the information. Of course, we all have it too, but he had built a reputation of being such an accurate bombardier, of dropping the bombs on target in training, that he was assigned to the lead airplane on the mission. So we followed them, and we triggered our bombs. When he dropped his bombs, we're all in formation. And when that lead bombardier, when we saw his bombs coming out of the bomb bay, we all dropped our bombs at the same time, so that if he was accurate, we were able to put a great concentration of 500-pound bombs right on that target. That's
Did you
theory, that's the way it worked.
Did you have total visibility all the time, or
No.
did you have problems with viewing through the window?
Yeah, it was a matter of
were there
humidity.
frost issues and
We had terrible time. Sometimes there was just too much humidity, and the whole instrument panel would just cover over with this frost. You couldn't even read the gauges on the instrument panel because it was all covered with this white frost. And it was kind of scary, to tell you the truth. And there was one little window right up. For some reason, it didn't, the ones that were facing directly into the wind, but this one was slanted. And that one usually didn't frost up. And so you could see the contrail, we call it, the condensation trail, the contrail of the bomber ahead of you. And we actually were navigating, looking up through that window and seeing the contrail and positioning ourselves to stay where we knew we were supposed to be. Actually navigating through a little window, watching the condensation trail of the bomber in front. So, and it wasn't always like that. For some reason, some of the times it'd be clear as a bell, and you could see anywhere. But sometimes, particularly in the wintertime, if the condensation was the certain percentage, everything wanted to fog up. Outside the airplane, inside the airplane. Anyway, you were awfully glad when you started coming home, because there on all of our maps we always had what was drawn on there by the intelligence department. They had like a piece of crayon or wax type of a color pencil, and they drew this bomb line, and it meant that anytime you got south of that bomb line, you were safe. They set it far enough south of where the German anti-aircraft guns were that once you got past that bomb line, coming south back to Foggia, you could kind of relax, because we had such air superiority as far as fighters were concerned. In the first place, the Germans didn't want to waste any of their aircraft trying to do combat with another Allied fighter plane. They wanted to shoot down bombers, because the bombers were the ones that were carrying these big loads of bombs. So we had almost no interference or resistance from German fighters. They weren't going to take a chance of losing one of their fighters against another fighter. They wanted to go after the bombers. They wanted to go after us. And
well, it sounds like an incredible experience you had. And just tell me, when you left the theater in Italy, after eventually becoming a fighter pilot in Pisa, what was your rank? What was your rank?
I was a first lieutenant.
Yeah.
If you had completed, at least in the bombing and the fighter bombers, you had to fly 100 missions before you were qualified to be sent home. And in the bombers, it started out that you could go home after 25 missions, because the losses were so severe that mathematically there was no way that you could complete 25 missions. Well, as we became more efficient, and we got more and more fighter aircraft that could fly long distances, like the P-51 with the Merlin engine. It made it possible to be in the air for a long time, but you were always so relieved once you got south of that bomb line, because this is where the American and British armies had already driven the Germans that far north.
Right.
And once you crossed that bomb line, you knew you were safe from there on, going on back down to Foggia.
Well, thanks, Glenn. I'm glad that you had a chance to tell us that story. It's one of many, but it certainly is incredible the way these